This audio file is a production of the Divinity School, the graduate professional school for the academic study of religion at the University of Chicago. Visit us online at divinity.uchicago.edu.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Margaret M. Mitchell. I'm the Dean of the Divinity School and Professor of New Testament and Early Christian Literature. On behalf of the faculty of the Divinity School, it is my honor and pleasure to welcome you to Paul Mendes-Flohr's inaugural lecture as Dorothy Grant McClear Professor of Modern Jewish History and Thought in the Divinity School. Before I introduce Professor Mendes-Flohr, I would like to say a few words about the chair that he now holds. At his death in 2001, James F. McClear left in his will a bequest to endow a professorship in the Divinity School in the honor of his mother, Dorothy Grant McClear. A career historian, McClear received his BA in the college and his PhD in August of 1947 from the University of Chicago Divinity School with a dissertation entitled The Puritan Party 1603 to 1643, a study in a lost Reformation. He wrote this dissertation under the direction of Professors James Hastings Nichols and Sidney E. Mead. Along with the chair that he has endowed, the Regenstein copy of his dissertation with us today marks James F. McClear's abiding presence. And I note as I looked at it this afternoon that fittingly, the first recipients of acknowledgments in James McClear's dissertation are the librarians of Swift Hall. And the librarians of Swift Hall carried out their work in this space. So we come back around. After his graduation from the university, James McClear joined the faculty at the University of Minnesota at Duluth in 1947. And he taught there until his retirement in 1993. A teaching career that spanned 46 years. His colleagues and former students remembered him as, and I have some quotes here, a distinguished scholar who did research for the sheer joy of discovery. A man who never made a show of his scholarly accomplishments, who had a monumental intelligence possessed of a quiet, yet often delightfully wicked sense of humor. In his scholarship, Professor McClear published articles in such venues as Church History, William and Mary Quarterly, Mississippi Valley Historical Review, the Journal of the History of Ideas, and the New England Quarterly. And, most importantly, he edited a volume entitled Church and State in the Modern Age, a Documentary History, published from the published by Oxford University Press in 1995, and I noted today still in print. As both a person and as a documentary and intellectual historian of religion in the modern period, James McClear has very much in common with Paul Mendes-Flohr. Internationally recognized as one of the foremost expositors of modern Jewish history and thought, Paul Mendes-Flohr joined the faculty of the University of Chicago Divinity School as professor in the year 2000, after having been professor of Jewish thought at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem for over 25 years. He is the author or co-author of over 13 books written in English, German, and Hebrew, which have in turn been translated into many languages, including Spanish, Arabic, and Japanese, and have appeared in multiple editions. He is also the editor of more than 25 volumes, including the critical edition underway of the works of Martin Buber Werkausgabe, a milestone of scholarship that will, when completed, total 22 volumes. Among Professor Mendes-Flohr's bountiful publications, I would single out for particular mention A Land of Two Peoples, Martin Buber and the Arabs, original 1982, republished with a new preface by the University of Chicago Press in 2005. Divided Passions, Jewish Intellectuals and the Experience of Modernity, Wayne State University Press, 1990, a book that was nominated for the National Jewish Book Award. And German Jews, A Dual Identity, Yale University Press, 1999. And last year, 2011, saw the third edition of the standard and hugely influential work that he co-edited with Yehuda Reinhartz, The Jew in the Modern World, a Documentary History, published by Oxford University Press, original 1980. It stands on the same shelf among Oxford UP documentary histories as that by James Maclear. Professor Mendes-Flohr's work is marked by enormous breadth of learning, combined with patient attention to texts and arguments, and insistence upon exacting historical contextualization. He is also passionate about the power of human thought, for good and for ill, at work on the planet, and the need for scholarship that combines uncompromising rigor with deep compassion. Like James Maclear, he is a monumental intelligence possessed of a quiet, yet often delightfully wicked sense of humor. The topic of his lecture this afternoon is Martin Buber and Martin Heidegger in Dialogue. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Paul Mendes-Flohr, Dorothy Grant Maclear Professor of Modern Jewish History and Thought in the Divinity School.
Some of you are puzzled by the fact I'm wearing a tie. It's the first time since my bar mitzvah that I have. When I first began to teach at the Hebrew University in the early 1970s, there was not sufficient office space for young faculty members. As a consequence, I had to share an office with some 15 neophytes in an asbestos bungalow. In effect, I had use of an office for about 1 hour a week to receive students. Some years later, I received the chair, the Leeds Lectureship in Comparative Religion, and I would bounce around the Hebrew University and telling everyone I had a chair but not an office. At the University of Chicago, I have a spacious office, and in fact, I have 2 offices, one in Swift Hall and another a cozy study in the Regenstein Library. And now I have both a chair and an office. But this is not the only reason I am grateful to be a member of the faculty of the University of Chicago. Here I have the privilege to have many fine students, and I trust they know I hold each of them in utmost esteem and indeed with affection. Here I also enjoy the gifts of extraordinary collegial fellowship and friendships. I am no less grateful for the dedicated support of the exceptional administrative and secretarial staff. May the angels above bless each of you. And protocol calls for me to wear a tie and to read my paper. I apologize for both, especially for reading the paper. I'm fully cognizant that it is often difficult to follow a red paper, particularly when it deals with dense and arcane subject matter. One is reminded of the German poet Goethe, who pointedly noted, Sprechen ist Natur. Speaking is natural. Hören is Kultur. To listen is culture. This holds also true for red texts. The cultural task falls upon you, and I fear it may not be an easy task. My perplexity about reading my lecture is, of course, compounded by the fact that I will speak about dialogue as grounded in the spoken word in the interpersonal address. So I will begin with an al-chet, a confession of sin, with the hope that if you do not forgive me, the good Lord will. And now the paper. I hope you notice the 2 wonderful photographers. No, don't be ashamed. This is my good profile. In the late spring of 1957, Buber and Heidegger met at the bucolic grounds of a castle perched some 300 meters above the eastern shore of Lake Constance, with a view of the Swiss Alps and the Upper Rhine to the south, Upper Rhine Valley to the south. The two septuagenarian philosophers stroll for hours in animated conversation. Recalling years later their meeting, Buber humorously mused that they must have appeared, and I quote, a la Rumpelstiltskin, like two dwarfs, gnomes with disproportionate large heads, neither stood more than 5'2" inches in height. In Platonic conversation, Heidegger setting the cadence, fervently gesticulating with both hands. The castle belonged to Prince Albrecht of Schaumburg-Lippe, the brother-in-law of Clemens, Count Perdevils, the general secretary of the Bavarian Academy of Fine Arts. Heidegger and Buber had come to Prince Albrecht's castle to confer together with Karl von Weizsäcker, a physicist, philosopher of science, the eldest brother of Richard von Weizsäcker, who in 1984 was to become the president of the Federal Republic of Germany. The three of them, together with Count Perdevils, conferred on the organization of a conference on language, Die Sprache, to take place under the auspices of the Academy in Munich. Between their meetings, Buber and Heidegger would take long walks, rambling walks on a nearby island of Mainau. We were able, Buber relates, to laugh about ourselves, two elderly, contentious men full of prejudices and resentment, less about our own than about the prejudices and resentment of our environment, here against the Jews, there against the Nazi rector. Buber parenthetically added, many are offended that I mention in my writings in one and the same breath, Kant, Hegel, and Heidegger. But since this meeting with Heidegger, I know that they are my critics. Inane or tasteless to have contested placing Heidegger on the same rung as these other thinkers. These reminiscences were solicited at the time by a young theologian, Hans Fischer Barnekow, who had learned that Buber's friendly, indeed conciliatory meeting with Heidegger led to a very vehement debate among Buber's circle of friends in Jerusalem. When Fischer Barnekow queried Buber about the controversy, Buber derisively dismissed any suggestion that the meeting was an expression of reconciliation. And I quote, "No, our discussion was purely a matter of fact. The past remained unmasted," a special German word, unbewältigt. God be praised, for we must also allow ourselves to speak bluntly about guilt, about forgiveness, about the guilt of thought, Schuld des Denkens. We spoke fully, impartially with one another and without defensiveness. First, we spoke for a long time about philosophical questions. Then, maybe more openly about what was initially suppressed theological matters, which, as you know, is for me, Buber, an alien language. I do not know whether Heidegger had confused this exchange with a religious dialogue, which it was not. Religious dialogue must emerge from experience, Erfahrung, and be addressed out of experience, and not only out of the experience of thought. At the conclusion of their hour-long walks, Heidegger extended to Buber an invitation to visit him in his Hütte, his cabin retreat in the Black Forest, and to continue their conversation. Buber declined the invitation. And I quote again, "A struggle between two elderly men is not good," even between young men. And we were in agreement that this struggle could not be avoided because a religious dialogue cannot be avoided. Presumably, this unavoidable dialogue was to be left to a younger generation. What constitutes a religious dialogue, as opposed to a philosophical and theological exchange, would be the implied theme of Buber's contribution to the envisioned conference on language. Crucial for Buber would be the distinction between the experience of thought, that is, the experience of the thinking I, which Heidegger set apart from the self of consciousness, and the experience of the self of consciousness, that is attentively aware to a reality external to oneself. In Heidegger's terms, the latter, the experience of ontic entities, as opposed to ontological meditations detached from the existential imperatives of concrete experience. Despite, but also perhaps because they studiously avoided what Buber regarded to be the difficult, truly existential questions attendant to Heidegger's Nazi past, Buber recalled his meeting with Heidegger warmly, noting that in person Heidegger, quote, is more to my taste than in his writings. In the aforementioned interview with Fischer Bonnekohl, Buber even took the opportunity to defend Heidegger from the widespread view that he lacked a sense of humor. He thus gleefully recounted that one evening in Prince Albrecht's castle, Heidegger read aloud from Johann Peter Hebel, an early 19th century German satirical poet. It was, Buber noted, an enchanting, artful, indeed enrapturing comic rendition. Curiously, when Heidegger was interviewed by the same Fischer Bonnekohl and queried whether he knew Buber, he responded as if he knew only of him by name. This feigned ignorance of Buber is not only confounding, given the reported intensity of the 2.5 days that they spent together at Lake Constance, which was followed during the course of over a year by several organizational meetings toward the conference on language. Moreover, Heidegger was apparently an avid reader of Buber's Tales of the Hasidim and other of his writings as well. Heidegger was also eager to solicit, if not Buber's friendship, then his public acknowledgement. Towards the preparation of a festschrift marking his 70th birthday, Heidegger requested at the editor of the volume to seek a contribution from Buber. The philosopher of dialogue declined, claiming poor health would not allow him to meet the stipulated deadline. We all use that, of course, excuse. Buber, however, continued to publish apace until his death some 6 years later. On another occasion, in the summer of 1959, Heidegger wrote Wilhelm Hoffmann, the director of the State Library in Stuttgart, requesting that he inform Buber, who was then visiting Germany, of a lecture on Hölderlin that he was to deliver at the Bebenhausen Monastery, which hosts the Hölderlin Archive. His eagerness to court Buber's acknowledgement is beclouded by the seeming paradoxical distancing of himself from Buber when queried by third parties about their relationship. At a discussion in 1964 with a small group of philosophers in Heidelberg, Heidegger was asked rather insistently by a young American philosopher how he regarded Buber's thought. Palpably perplexed by the question, Heidegger hesitantly replied, "Buber hardly dealt with my basic question," and quickly added that he was, however, not sure. Heidegger's hesitation to acknowledge publicly his relationship with Buber and familiarity with his writings may be due to his reluctance to engage in the kind of dialogue demanded by Buber. Or he may have been simply confused, if not offended, by Buber's resolute refusal to continue their conversation, at least on terms other than which Buber deemed existentially appropriate. In a conversation with Heidegger in the early winter of 1964, Fischer Bonnekohl gained the feeling that he was still deeply troubled by his failed relationship with Buber, and accordingly wrote the Jewish sage, quote, "I'm again and again moved to believe that it might indeed be correct and good were you to grant Heidegger's wish to have another talk with him. Perhaps it would help him." Buber seems not to have replied. Buber's relationship with the Bavarian Academy of Fine Arts preceded his acquaintance with Heidegger, occasioned by the preparations for a conference on language. In the spring of 1954, the president of the Academy, the renowned stage designer Emil Pretorius, wrote Buber inviting him to hold a lecture at the Academy on Art and the Problem of Man. Buber gratefully accepted, and after a further exchange of letters suggested as a title for his lecture, man in his image, der Mensch und sein Gebild. The lecture was held at the Academy on November 9th, 1954. Buber's visit to the Academy also occasioned an apparently lively discussion on language with Count Podewils. In a letter dated April 30th, 1955, Count Podewils recalled their conversation in which they discuss Buber's Bible translation and his distinctive use of archaic layers of the German language. Podewils was particularly taken by Buber's rendering of the account of creation, to which Buber tersely replied, "Billige gibt es die Sprache nicht her." The German language is incapable of yielding the event of creation more perfectly than with its archaic poetic registers. Concurring with Buber's apodictic claim, Podewils noted the rhythmic, in this quote, the rhythmic primal principle of our language, unexcavated, indeed buried in the rubble of later layers, draws one like a vortex into a maelstrom. With great intensity, Buber and Podewils exchanged letters between Jerusalem and Munich in which they discussed the nature of the German language and the problems of language in general. At one point in their epistolary dialogue, Buber broached the idea of a conference on language, and it was also Buber who urged Podewils to solicit the participation of Heidegger, a proposal that Podewils accepted with alacrity. Upon speaking with Heidegger, Podewils wrote Buber, "Martin Heidegger was very impressed by your readiness to collaborate with him." Heidegger indicated that he shared Buber's conviction that without the participation of Karl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, the project would come to naught. He was also amenable to meeting with Buber and von Weizsäcker for a preliminary meeting, Vorbesprechung, mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, at Prince Albert's castle on the shores of Lake Constance. Indeed, Heidegger was even ready to cancel a previously contracted speaking engagement to accommodate Buber's schedule. That it was Buber who initiated the collaboration with Heidegger is, as one would say in German, merkwürdig, rather astounding, for Buber had been a consistent critic of Heidegger. A few years earlier, he published in Merkur, which billed itself as a German journal for European thought, founded just after the Second World War, to revalorize, again in terms of the journal, good old Enlightenment values. And he published there an article which sternly castigated Heidegger's embrace of National Socialism. Upon receiving Buber's article, the editor of Merkur, Hans Peschke, dashed off a letter with a request that Buber modify his criticism of Heidegger. Quote, the wounds of the post-war era are already great. Must we make them worse? Buber respectfully rejected Peschke's implorations, beseeching him to understand that whereas he, Peschke, the editor of Merkur, refers to metaphorical wounds, I am talking about real wounds, millions of them. Buber's critique of Heidegger was not merely ethical, however. It was philosophical, ad rem, rather than ad hominem. Reaching back to his inaugural course of lectures at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in 1938, he wrote a series of lectures and essays critical of Heidegger's ontology, of his reading of the poet Hölderlin, of his interpretation of Heraclitus, and of his brand of existentialism and its political implications. In the very first lecture Buber delivered in Germany after the war, namely upon receiving the Goethe Prize from the city of Hamburg in 1953, Buber spoke of the validity and limitations of the political principle, with a clear allusion to Carl Schmitt's Manichaean conception of the political, in particular and more generally to the political and historiographical ethos that embedded the horror from which Europe had just emerged. He traces this ultimately pernicious ethos to the philosophical tendency inaugurated by Hegel to assign to history an ontological autonomy. The consequent rendering of historical time and its political manifestations are as inherently self-validating, attained, so Buber, quintessential expression with Heidegger's ontological affirmation of history as the locus of truth, the disclosure of meaning of being. And I quote, "The existentialism of Heidegger is rooted in Hegel's thought, but in a deeper level, indeed the deepest possible level. For Hegel, world history is the absolute process in which the spirit attains the consciousness of itself. So for Heidegger, historical existence is the illumination of being itself. In neither Hegel nor Heidegger is there room for a supra-historical reality that sees history and judges it." Despite his unequivocal condemnation of Heidegger's intellectual allegiance to National Socialism, Buber was eager to engage Heidegger in philosophical debate. Indeed, as he explained to a Jewish colleague, he justified his encounter with Heidegger by explaining, quote, "I have already said what I have to say against him." He was presumably referring to his earlier article in Mercure, or perhaps to his conversations with Heidegger at the shores of Lake Constance. Having expressly stated his ad hominem critique, he was now ready to engage Heidegger ad rem and to explore with him issues of common concern while exposing what he regarded to be the conceptual flaws of Heidegger's ontology. As is systematically explicated in a recently published 500-page monograph by a young German scholar, Micah Siegfried, Buber and Heidegger may be understood as sharing a similar project. Both sought to overcome, she forcefully argues, the modern conception of the cognitive subject as propounded by philosophers from Descartes to Husserl. Siegfried's meticulous study is thus appropriately entitled Abkehr vom Subjekt, turning away or departing from the subject. Buber's I-thou relation and Heidegger's existence in the world are so constructed as to wrench philosophy from what they deemed to be the myopic focus on the isolated subject of cognition. And both ultimately turn to language, or more precisely, the speech act, as the fulcrum liberating thought from its solipsistic subject-centeredness. Yet Buber, who assigned the dialogical speech the exigent role of revitalizing humanism from the spiritual debris left in the wake of the World War, felt that Heidegger's conception of language was inadequate to the task. As we have seen after his initial encounter with Heidegger at the estate of Prince Albrecht, he realized their exchange would perforce be limited to philosophical issues and lingering questions of Heidegger's endorsement of Hitler's regime, and thus preclude what Buber would regard to be a genuine dialogue. Buber was undoubtedly aware that although Heidegger celebrated the fascist aspects of National Socialism as representing modern humanity's resistance to global technology and promoted the exclusion of the Jews from the cultural and social life of Germany, he did not sanction their mass extermination. This might mitigate Heidegger's guilt, but certainly does not exonerate him from supporting the heinous political crimes of National Socialism, certainly in Buber's eyes. I'm sorry I can't share this with you, but there was perhaps a more fundamental consideration that prompted Buber to engage Heidegger in philosophical debate and overlook, as it were, his association with National Socialism, and for that matter, to collaborate with Podewils and Pastorius and other of the Bavarian Academy of Fine Arts. Like most other participants in the organization of the Conference on Language, as conservative intellectuals at least tacitly supported the Third Reich. Even von Weizsäcker, whose prestige as a post-war German public intellectual and peace activist was deemed crucial to ensure the credibility of the conference, he played a prominent role in Nazi Germany's attempt to develop a nuclear bomb. Buber's motive to engage these individuals in a public forum on what he regarded as the urgent task of reaffirming humanism may possibly be discerned from the address he gave upon receiving in September 1953 the Peace Prize of the German book trade. Before an audience of dignitaries gathered at Frankfurt's historic Paulskirche, Buber unflinchingly spoke of, and I quote, the memory of the 12-year reign of Homo contra humanus, of what we now call the Shoah. He proceeded to present himself as a survivor, widely perceived to be, I'm quoting him, an Archjew, Erzjude, who was chosen as a symbol. As a symbol, he recognized it as his Pflicht, his duty, not to forget that, and I can quote, a considerable number of Germans killed millions of my people in a systematically prepared and executed procedure whose organized cruelty cannot be compared with any previous historical event. Buber then spoke of the great many who knew that a monstrous event was taking place and did not oppose it. But my heart, which is acquainted with the weakness of men, refuses to condemn my neighbor for not prevailing upon himself to become a martyr. He noted yet another category of men and women who, in effect, passively played a role in the horror that befell the Jewish people, namely those who choose to remain ignorant, who fearful of facing the bitter reality that lay behind the rumors which were circulating. Then there were the heroic few who actively resisted, prepared to pay the dreadful price of martyrdom. It is a symbol, Buber continued, was also his duty, and I quote, to step out of memory into the present. The Volkshumana, the voice of humanity, must be awakened and heard once again. But, Buber underscored, not only listened to, it must be answered and let out of the lonely monologue into the awakening dialogue of peoples. Nota bene, the corporate noun peoples, Volke. Peoples must engage and talk with one another. Die Volke müssen ins Gespräch kommen if the devastated life of the earth is to renew itself. The universal compass of this challenge is attested to by the fact that Buber contributed the prize money, which was considerable, attached to the Peace Prize and the early Goethe Prize to a scholarship fund for Arab students at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I should say parenthetically, also at his death in his will, he left a very considerable sum and this for the same purpose. Due to seemingly interminable scheduling problems, the Vorbesprechung toward the preparatory discussions toward the Conference on Language first took place in May 1957. Potterville's prepared a protocol of the meeting, which was summarized in a letter penned by Pretorius and addressed jointly to Buber, Heidegger, and Weizsäcker, who together, in effect, constituted an organizing committee for the planned Conference on Language. As the president of the Bavarian Academy of Fine Arts, Pretorius thanked them for their constructive deliberations that, as he put it, with oblique delicacy, not only, quote, bridged spatial distance. As the official convener of the conference, Pretorius explained that it was his task to accentuate their common concern, that's quoting, for the fate of language, for the endangered relation of human beings to language. Turning to practical matters, Pretorius noted that he was in accord with the recommendation that Buber should open the conference and that a full evening be allotted for his lecture and a subsequent discussion. The title of Buber's lecture was to be tentatively entitled Die Eigentlichkeit des Wortes, the actuality of the word. Pretorius expressed reservations about the suggestion to invite Friedrich Gogarten to deliver a lecture on the Sprache der Verkündigung, the language of preaching, the gospel of God's word. In spite of his esteem for the Protestant theologian, Pretorius reasoned one should perhaps renounce on his participation in order to allow Buber to eschew, to avoid a focus on the Old Testament, and to develop his fundamental position on language as dialogue. Sprache als Gespräch. As Pretorius somewhat awkwardly put it, a conference with Gogarden and, not the way he puts it, you'll forgive him, D. Mitchell, and the Catholic could easily slide into a philosophy of religion. The Jesuit, the Catholic, he referred to elliptically in this somewhat almost nasty fashion, was the Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner, whom Buber had apparently suggested inviting. The title of Heidegger's lecture is given in the protocol without comment as the Herkunft der Sprache, the origin of language. Finally, Pretorius urged the organizing community to include in the conference program a lecture on poetry, reminding him that the Academy is an institution promoting the creative arts, hence the consideration of poetry and the problem of language would be most appropriate. He suggests that the committee consider inviting Ernst Junger, and as he put it, a well-established, proven author. The suggestion to include Junger in the program is indicative of the conservative leanings of Pretorius. To be sure, Junger was an exceedingly popular author in the immediate post-war years in Germany. But despite his studied distance from National Socialism, he had pronounced fascist and anti-Semitic views, which he never quite recanted. Consequent to a lecture tour in the U.S., which was to have brought Buber to the University of Chicago, he could not attend a second preparatory meeting, which took place in March 1958, and in which Heidegger was joined by the musicologist, George Georgandis, and the Catholic theologian Roman Guarandini. Heidegger expressed a certain frustration that Buber did not participate, apparently interpreting it as indicative of a measure of equivocation on Buber's part. In a letter to Podevils dated June 11, 1958, he complains, "Mit Buber bleibt die Sache schwierig." The Buber matters remain difficult, and expressed his apprehension that Buber in the end will cancel his participation in the conference. Buber nonetheless did take part in the next and decisive meeting, which took place in Munich on the 24th of June 1958. This time, Buber attended along with Heidegger, Georgandis, I've had dental surgery, so I still have the after effects of whatever, so you'll forgive me. Guarandini, Weizsäcker, Pretorius, Podevils, and the literary critic Kurt Hohoff, who represented the Berlin Academy der Künste, which was to host a rerun of the conference. From the protocol of this meeting, it is clear that at the center of the conference would be the lectures by Buber and Heidegger. The protocol provides a brief synopsis of both their lectures and only theirs. Buber's lecture is now entitled Das Wort, das gesprochen wird, the word that is spoken. I'm skipping a lot of details, so you don't have to be overly bored. Perhaps in order to capture the spoken word as an event, Heidegger exchanged the title of his lecture, under which it was presented at the conference, the Weg zur Sprache, the way to language. Before considering in detail Buber's and Heidegger's contrasting understanding of what constitutes the act of speech or the spokenness of language, I would like to turn briefly to an exchange between Buber and Guarandini, as recorded in the protocol of June 1958 meeting. Their exchange illuminates what Buber means by religious dialogue. Buber requested Guarandini to define more precisely how he understood religious as given in the proposed title of his, Guarandini's lecture, namely the religious word. The question boils down, Buber averred, to whether it is, this is all in the protocol, to whether it is conceivable that God speaks and that man replies. Does the word that stems from God and the human word that comes in response have a specific character? The protocol goes on to note that Herr Buber expounds upon the question, can God and his word be universally spoken? That is, to individuals mentioned for whom neither God nor his word have any reality. How may we deal with such a theme as the religious word, such that the unbeliever can receive it? Responding to this latter question, Guarandini remarks, in order for this to happen, that is, for the unbeliever to be receptive to God's address, my lecture must touch upon the word of the gospel. To which Buber replied by explaining that what he meant is precisely an unbounded word which does not come from the realm of the religious, so as to meet the reality of non-believers, in which the word can penetrate. Thereupon, again quoting the protocol, Herr Guarendi posed the rhetorical question whether every word which is spoken authentically is not religious. The protocol concludes by noting that Herr Buber concurs with Guarendi, but nonetheless expresses doubts about all theories that regard language as given specifically by God. That is, theories that do not take into account humans as the actual speakers of language. In trying to push Guarendi to adjust his conception of the religious to the sensibilities of non-believers, Buber seems to have shared Heidegger's concern that the Catholic theologian would lend the conference, and I quote Heidegger, an unwarranted narrow confessional cast. After more than a year's preparation, with the exchange of close to 100 letters and 4 joint preparatory meetings and individual meetings by Pandavils with Buber in Munich, Paris, and Zurich, and with Heidegger in Munich, the date of the conference on language was set for the 17th to the 22nd of November 1958 in Munich, and a week later to be repeated in Berlin at the Akademie der Künste. But it was not to come to pass. You'll notice, Dean Mitchell, that this is more exasperating than organizing this meeting than a faculty search. In early August of 1957, Buber and his wife, Paula, boarded a ship in Venice that was to take them back to Israel after a lecture tour in Europe. Suddenly, Paula, a robust woman of 81, collapsed and was rushed to hospital. She died less than 2 weeks later and was buried in the ancient Jewish cemetery at the Lido in Venice. The profoundly bereaved Buber returned to Israel, uncertain how he would proceed after the loss of his wife and most intimate partner of nearly 60 years. To a friend he wrote, "The structure of my life has been broken apart so thoroughly that I must give up all plans to lecture abroad, including Munich." Pandavils was besides himself when he learned of Buber's decision to cancel his participation in the conference. Hurt and bewildered, he sought to persuade Buber to reconsider his decision, and reported that Heidegger also greeted the news of his cancellation as ein großer Ausfall, a great loss. How could the conference take place without Buber? As a possible solution, Pandavils suggested that Buber submit his texts to be read on his behalf at the conference. Buber declined, explaining that at this difficult juncture in his life, he no longer had the requisite spiritual focus to write the lecture he had intended for the conference. He would be glad to send his greetings to the conference from Jerusalem, however. Pandavils resolved to go ahead with the conference, which was now rescheduled for the 19th to the 23rd of January 1959. In a letter to Buber dated 2 months later, the 9th of March 1959, Pandavils shared with Buber Heidegger's reflections on the conference and Buber's absence. All that remains, Heidegger bemoaned, is, quote, dialectic and information, but not a dialogue in a sense of speaking out of listening to one another. Buber replied that he did not agree that dialogue per se is dead. Rather, it is a persistent, unflagging commitment to dialogue that has been lost. A rededication to the, quote, the indivisible truth of dialogue is therefore all the more urgent. Gradually emerging from mourning the death of his wife, Buber agreed to come to Munich in July 1960 and participate in a small follow-up conference on the word, the spoken word, and reality. The theme of Buber's lecture was the same that he had originally planned to give at the conference on language, the Sprache, namely the word that is spoken. In the meantime, Potterville sent to him a copy of the handwritten text of Heidegger's conference lecture. Buber evidently studied the text carefully in preparing his own lecture for the July conference. Although he does not expressly refer to Heidegger in his lecture, virtually all the many press reports on the conference interpreted Buber's lecture as a reply to Heidegger, which is the perspective I will assume in my analysis of Heidegger and Buber's lectures on speech as dialogue. Delivered on the 11th of July 1960 in the Aula, this big auditorium of the University of Munich, the word that is spoken was, for the 82-year-old Buber, not just another occasional lecture or a mere intellectual exercise. Although penned with a controlled cadence and a carefully crafted conceptual dialectic, it was animated by a palpable existential earnestness. As a point of departure, he endorses Heidegger's premise, again without explicitly referring to his adversary, that language is a distinctive mode of existence, Seinsweise. Or, as Heidegger put it in his lecture, language qua speech is the foundation of human being. To be sure, both Buber and Heidegger agree that speech may be silent. To cite Heidegger, a man may speak endlessly and all the time say nothing. Another man may remain silent, not speak at all, and yet, without speaking, say a great deal. To speak is to say something, that is, to point to the clearing or the life world in which one's being unfolds. Language as saying, sagen, is the clearing of da, which constitutes the being of man as Dasein, of a concrete, emphatically individual existence. In this respect, Heidegger cites the German Romantic author Jean Paul, that language is the spiritual index finger, the geistige Zeigefinger. Heidegger thus infers that all true language is in its nature destiny. To Buber's mind, Heidegger's principal focus on the ontological structure of language neglects the intersubjective dimension of the spoken word. The ontological character of language as speech, and I'm quoting again from Buber, would be completely missed, Buber underscored, if one regards it as existing outside the personal texture of speech. Every attempt to understand and to explain the ontological structure of language as accessible only when detached from the context of its actual speakers must lead us astray. For the ontological basic presupposition of dialogue is the otherness of one's partner in conversation. And that otherness is manifest in, quoting Buber again, in the moment of surprise. One can never anticipate, nor should one anticipate what the other might say. For the other is an utterly autonomous subject. Employing Heidegger's distinction between existential and existentiel, the self in relation to being and the self as a particular entity, Buber bemoans the desocratizing of Socrates. You can do that in German. Desocratizing of speech by philosophers who are well acquainted with the existential, but not with the existentiel expression of language. The attendant hubris that allows philosophers to treat language as a self-contained monologue is something, and Buber, quoting again Buber, something that rarely happens to a poet. This latter remark, with reference to the poet, is of course an acerbic allusion to Heidegger's view that poetry is the quintessence of language and thinking. All reflective thinking is poetic, and all poetry, Mrs. Heidegger, is a kind of thinking. For all genuine thinking, Denken, is poetic, dichterisch, illuminating our Reisen, Ausdichtung, a creative linguistic act that clears a space, Einräumung, for entities as entities to come into the open by naming them. Not all thinking, of course, is poetic. Continuing to quote Heidegger, nor is all poetry thoughtful, but true philosophy is denkerisch, dichterisch, both thoughtful and poetic. Without disputing this proposition, Buber insists that poetry, correctly understood, is dialogical. And again, I quote Buber, for the poem is spokenness to the thou, wherever this partner may be. Buber continues to probe the philosophical, or rather the epistemic, and ultimately ontological significance of poetry. But, so it may be asked, if this is so, again quoting Buber, if it is not a metaphor but a fact that the poem is spokenness, then does that necessarily mean that the poem as dialogue can be regarded according to its content of truth? Buber answers this question in the affirmative. That is, if the truth attested to by the poet is not an expressible what? The poet does not evoke a reality outside the act of speaking. On the contrary, the truth of which the poet speaks is bound to his or her inner existence. The poet says what he or she means. The relation between meaning and saying points us to the relation between the intended unity of meaning and saying on the one side, and that between meaning and saying and the personal existence itself on the other side. And here comes the punch. What Buber clearly intends to be a decisive blow against the entire edifice of Heidegger's existential ontology. The truth that the poet bespeaks, Buber proclaims in nigh prophetic diction, and I quote, is not the sublime unconcealment suitable to the being itself, the aletheia of the Greeks. It is a simple conception of truth of the Hebrew Bible, emet, whose etymological root means faithfulness, the faithfulness of human beings or the faithfulness of God. The truth of the word that is genuinely spoken is, in its highest forms, in poetry, and incomparably still more so in that message saying, Spruch, that descends out of the stillness over a disintegrating human world, an indivisible unity. It is a faithful truth, eine getreue Wahrheit, in relation to the person addressed, whom the speaker means as such, no matter whether, this is crucial, whether he or bears a name or is anonymous, is familiar or alien. The human truth of which I speak, the truth vouchsafed to man, is no Pneuma that pours itself out from above on a band of men now become super-personal, überpersönhaft. And the human truth of which I speak rather opens itself only in one's existence as a person, this concrete person, in the life space allotted to him, answers with his faithfulness for the word that is spoken by him. This statement with which Buber concluded his lecture brings to a full crescendo his critique of Heidegger as betraying the humanistic tradition of German philosophy and letters. This tradition is betrayed by an ontology that neglects the interpersonal responsibility of the individual to the other, be he or she a stranger who bears no name, and allows for the celebration of the superpersonal social and political entities in our disintegrating human world. That reaffirmation of humanism is Buber's animating concern, is attested to by his contribution he made at an international conference in 1947, marking the bicentennial of the birth of Goethe. Buber was invited to participate in the conference by Robert Maynard Hutchins, then Chancellor of the University of Chicago, who served as the chair of the conference, which incidentally took place in this, I'm now turning to my friends Rick, Dick, and and Sylvia Kaufman, which took place in Aspen, Colorado. They're denizens of Aspen. Because, I quote from the program, Aspen as a small, simple, and somewhat remote community was deemed to be free of the distractions of a large city, thus permitting the type of reflection worthy of the great German poet and humanist. Buber appropriately entitled his contribution, Remarks on Goethe's Concept of Humanity. In his exposition, he notes that Goethe anticipates what in our own age has been defined as fromness, Geworfenheit, a term, of course, coined by no other than Heidegger to denote the mode of being into which one is thrown by destiny. Buber proceeds to explain that in this context, Goethe refers to man as a creature who in the anguished realization that his Faustian ambition is ultimately a vacuous vanity, experiences himself as a creature. It is obvious, Buber continues, that Goethe does not mean here a mere creature among creatures, but the true essence of humanity reveals itself not in the species, but in the person of whom Goethe calls the edler Mensch, the noble individual. And Goethe's edler Mensch achieves a true humanity only by being, in Goethe's disarmingly simple formulation, quote, helpful and kind, qualities that again, to cite the poet, that distinguish us from all other beings known to us. Goethe's vision of the noble individual, Buber pointedly contends, bears a message, both extorting and encouraging, also to our time, although precisely because it is so evidently remote from embodying those qualities that constitute human nobility. We have no written record of how Heidegger reacted to Buber's critique. From the discussions he had with Buber toward the organization of the Conference on Language, he certainly had a clear idea of Buber's position. One can thus discern within his lecture comments that may be construed as an anticipatory response to Buber, such as when he acknowledges that, and I quote, that this sounds as if it were talking of a selfish solipsism, but language does not insist upon itself alone in the sense of purely self-seeking, all oblivious self-admiration. As saying the nature of language is showing which disregards precisely itself in order to free that which is shown to its authentic appearance. Nonetheless, the ontological structure of language qua the spoken word can only be properly ascertained when it is considered in and of itself, indeed a monologue. For, and again quote Heidegger, it is language alone which speaks authentically, and language speaks lonesomely. Heidegger undoubtedly felt that Buber failed to understand this argument. One may surmise that he would have reiterated what he wrote in 1952 to Hannah Arendt. Martin Buber clearly knows nothing about philosophy. But then he added, with a touch of ironic generosity, surely he does not really need to either. Arendt probably did not share Heidegger's judgment. She held Buber in high esteem, especially with respect to his intellectual and political integrity. Heidegger's disdainful dismissal of Buber's philosophical credentials was occasioned by the article previously mentioned that Buber published in Merkur in February 1952. 6 months later, Heidegger came across yet another article by Buber, Hoffnung für diese Stunde, Hope for this hour, published in the same journal. His response this time was nothing less than ecstatic. In a letter to his wife, Heidegger, in exultant tones, reports the essay by M. Buber, in which he speaks of the exigent need for the post-war generation to reestablish existential trust, is excellent. And when you're here, at the time Heidegger was ensconced in his cabin at the edge of the Black Forest, we'll have plenty to say about it. The diagnosis is very far-sighted and of great wisdom. But the healing must start even deeper than he, Buber, suggests. And there remains a question of whether we mortals address our eternal vow we means God, Buber of course, through our mortal saying thou to one another, or whether we aren't brought into correspondence with one another only through God's address. The question remains whether this either or is sufficient at all, or whether both the one and the other had to be prepared even more primordially, ursprünglich. A preparation which, of course, again requires the divine address and its protection. The final sentence in Buber's essay continues, is beautiful and essential. Reconciliation affects reconciliation. Versöhnung wirkt Versöhnung. And Heidegger adds, mere forgiving and asking for forgiveness are not enough. Reconciliation belongs with atonement, and thus really means to stillen, to bring one another the stillness of belonging to one another in essence. Wesenszugehörigkeit. The genuine and fruitful and fundamentally ceaseless dialogue, Gespräch, is one where those conversing, although different in kind, intuitively recognize this, their Wesenszugehörigkeit, and neither out of mere indifferent acceptance, nor according to a single yardstick and its doctrine. In light of these reflections on the existential ground of reconciliation, it would seem that the failure of Buber and Heidegger to achieve the dialogue both manifestly sought was due to their different conceptions of what Buber called religious encounter. Buber had expected that what the poet Paul Celan, who upon a visit to Heidegger's cabin retreat in 1966, inscribed in the Philosopher's Guestbook, mit einer Hoffnung auf ein kommendes Wort im Herzen, with the hope for a word coming in the heart. Heidegger was reluctant to utter the word Buber and Celan had hoped for, because he apparently deemed it but a surface gesture. The genuine act of atonement is to be expressed and attained beyond words, in the stillness in which an existential bond is forged between individuals, regardless of their primordial and historical differences. The seemingly insurmountable divide between Buber and Heidegger may have been also and perhaps ultimately theological, or rather more precisely put, their divergent horizons of expectation. A wonderful term in German historiography, Erwartungshorizonte, were inflected by contrasting conceptions of grace and atonement. Heidegger, who, as you may recall, initially studied to be for the Catholic priesthood, articulated these differences succinctly in his letter to his wife. Permit me then to cite once again a key passage in that letter. And there remains, he explained to his wife, a question of whether we mortals address our eternal vow, Buber means God, through our mortal saying thou to one another, or whether we are brought into correspondence to one another only through God's address. The question remains whether this either or is sufficient at all, or whether both the one and the other have to be prepared even more primordially. A preparation which, of course, again requires the divine address and its protection. God's commanding word bears within it a protective grace and thus empowers one to trust in the promise of reconciliation. Buber and perhaps also Celan's opposing view of reconciliation was, if you will, informed by a Jewish theological sensibility that atonement proceeds on two parallel trajectories, which, although theologically correlated, are in practice separate. Yom Kippur exemplifies this bifurcated conception of atonement. The rituals and prayers of this day of fasting and penitence are dedicated to beseeching God to forgive one for religious sins and for these transgressions alone. But there is no atonement for offenses against God until one has turned to one's neighbors whom one has offended and not only begs forgiveness, but has righted the wrong done to them. When I commenced my research on this paper, I shared the assumption of Buber's critics that Heidegger's eagerness to engage Buber in dialogue was prompted by a desire to receive from him an arch-Jew exculpation, or Celan bitterly put it when he first heard of Buber's meeting with Heidegger, a Persil-Schein, a Persil passport, a whitewash for his Nazi past. That may be true, but the failed encounter was also what Buber would call Vergegnung, a mismeeting born of divergent expectations of what constitutes dialogical reconciliation. The late political scientist and sociologist Ralph Dahrendorf held that when one is tempted to say something lyrical, one should promptly bring a lecture to a close. But being of weak character and incorrigibly prone to schmaltz, I will prove myself a lyrical peroration. In his contribution to the conference on Goethe, Robert Hutchins, representing the University of Chicago, I imagine you all heard of that institution, observed that, and I quote, Goethe's faith in goodness, his faith in humanity, his faith in the goodness of humanity is a solid ground beneath the feet of those who refuse to be drawn into the morass of cynicism and despair. This faith is a creative force, a force that can make us better than we are, and that will lead others to have trust in us and become better than they have been. Through this faith, we may lay the foundation of the civilization of dialogue. Through this faith, we may bring about the moral, intellectual, and spiritual revolution which unites mankind in lasting peace. These edificatory words by Hutchins, which echo Buber's dialogical humanism, have left a distinctive stamp on the ethos of the University of Chicago. This is one further reason I'm grateful to be a member of the faculty of the Divinity School, chair or no chair. Thank you.
Such a lecture cannot end without dialogue. So the floor is open for comments and questions and discussion for about 20 minutes or so.
Don't be shy. Yes, sir.
You spoke about poetry. I assume that poetry is not defined by the lack of punctuation or by rhyming. Rather, it's a matter of what is attempted by the poet, by the communication. And therefore, would it be correct from a Buberesque point of view to say that a poem doesn't exist separate and apart from the person reading it? The I doesn't exist separate and apart from I it or I thou. There is no I without connection. So does a poem have no real existence unless you are establishing who is reading it, and in what form, and in what mode of existence he is at the time he's reading it.
Yeah, the premise of Buber, of course, as I stated, as you'll correctly intuit or surmise, is the dialogical dimension of poetry. Is written for in response to a human situation, and of course it is to be heard by whoever reads it or hears it. Buber emphasizes the dialogical character of poetry. As he puts it in German, the spokenness, Gesprochenheit of poetry. So your insight is, of course, indeed valid, or captures what Buber's intention was. Please.
That's meant for pretty much it.
You speak a bit louder.
Yeah, there's a little polemic against Judaism that's theocratic. So Josephus said that Judaism is not theocratic, and then Spinoza argued that Judaism is not theocratic. And turning to Buber, I was expecting him to kind of give an alternative articulation of what Jewish politics would look like. But reading Paths of Utopia, he actually seems to like the theocracy. And I'm just like, I'm troubled and disturbed by this because this was just really unexpected when I read this. And is Buber a theocrat?
The question will take us far afield, so I can just tell you perhaps you should attend a class now and give it in the fall with Professor Sattler on Jewish political theology. But Buber has obviously a very distinctively articulated view of what constitutes a culture or a society that is governed by some sense of God's presence, God's word, but it's not strictly theocratic as, for instance, Spinoza would claim. But to give you a fuller answer at this point, I think it would take us far afield. I can only invite you to attend our class. We'll let you sit in the first row. Please.
What was Buber's connection with Gadamer?
I'm sorry?
Gadamer, did he play a role in Buber's? Yes.
Just 2 weeks ago, Jürgen Habermas gave a lecture in Jerusalem, inaugurating an annual lecture on Martin Buber, who was the founder of the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities. I wasn't there because I was here. I was with the dentist, actually. But I understand Habermas indeed suggested there's a parallel between Gadamer's project and Buber's. As you recall, there's a beautiful essay by Gadamer, Habermas on Gadamer, in which he has that wonderful titles, The Urbanization of the Province. That Gadamer takes Heidegger from the province, from a provincial understanding of the philosophical discourse, and brings it into the reality of the city, where we have to live with one another, not just as a recluse, far from civilization, but within the gut of human relationships. And in that sense, of course, one can also understand the urbanization of the dialogical. Please.
I have a question. Heidegger was notorious, so reading his biographies, he was notorious for not renouncing his position. Yeah, during the National Socialism, I think it was this famous Spiegel interview. Yeah, and this is what caused a lot of disturbance also after the war. I'm just curious because you voted this letter to his wife, I think, when he said words are not enough for reconciliation, and it's about this bringing to stealing and so on. So are you inclined to see his public, let us say, silence, not as a kind of a personal coarseness or lack of self-reflexivity, but as a kind of a deeper philosophical attitude?
Since our friend speaks very softly,
yeah, absolutely.
No, fine. I just repeat the question. The question is whether how we are to assess Heidegger's reluctance to acknowledge.
Yeah, and just to apologize, at least to apologize and say, you know, what I was wrong, as many people did.
Yeah, as if maybe we had lunch or a beer or a glass of wine, I would give you my opinion, but as a scholar, I must avoid apologizing what another individual.
We're going to have beer in a little bit.
Very welcome to join us. As a scholar, I cannot please make any assessment.
You mentioned the letter, yeah? And
I would like to focus on the written documents. Of course, there's much discussion about why Heidegger was not prepared to acknowledge and repent, so to speak. And there's now a whole literature and almost an industry on Heidegger on this question. I was suggesting that there may be another dimension to this reluctance to acknowledge publicly his endorsement of at least in the early period. Nazism had several layers or several stations of development. we only have in the early years, 1933 and 34, explicit statements of his endorsement of certain features of Nazism, which are obviously to be condemned. Certainly, as a nice Jewish boy, well, a nice Jewish boy, not a Jewish boy, are problematic. I at least give the credit that he was struggling with this issue. The letter to his wife was private. He spoke about responding to Buber very warmly with respect to the need to reestablish existential trust, reconciliation, and what he endorses, since it's just powerful. It's a simple statement. Reconciliation begets reconciliation. He clearly identifies with that statement. Again, it goes on, as I tried to repeat, that atonement is not through words alone. It's just a powerful statement. It shares in stillness a sense of our commonality, our common connection to something we call being.
But here's also the split with Buber, who obviously did expect some words.
From a Jewish perspective, I suggest that theologically one has to acknowledge what the hurt, the pain, the one that's caused the other, intentionally or inadvertently. Please.
I'm curious if you could say more about the passage in Buber's response to Heidegger, where he connects his notion of language to element to truth. And I was wondering if you could say something about the status of Hebrew and ostensibly probably the Hebrew Bible in that claim, especially in response to Heidegger, for whom we know that German and Greek serve a particular function of source. What kind of claim is he making in saying that he ties truth to that Hebrew concept? What kind of status is the Hebrew Bible in the language serving for him?
That's a very fine question. Thank you, Sarah. Very simply, and man, as Buber understands it, the biblical conception of truth is probably best understood as truthfulness. Truthfulness to oneself and the other. Maybe comes under the term integrity, which of course is not a philosophical statement, but it's one that has existential relevance for Buber. And as you perhaps undoubtedly know, the Hebrew term for faith, the biblical term for faith also means trust. And so that's the link that Buber brings into the discussion, trust. And Heidegger's ontology, which he doesn't dispute, because it doesn't really bear upon these questions, especially when you speak about language as dialogue.
So is the claim something like my conception of language has roots to this particular culture as opposed to your conception of language has roots to this other particular culture? Or is the claim something like a notion of truth has an originary link to this Hebrew term, and thus there's a kind of more originary? Is he making a claim along the lines of Heidegger, like, oh, there's an originary status to this notion of truth? Or is he saying something subjective about his own? And what status does the Bible serve? As a foundational document, or as an exemplary site to find this concept?
Yeah. I think if you put I think the way you put it now is exemplary of a certain type of human way you would put it, Alton. And another his famous book, Ein Val, opens up and says there are two types of attitudes. The German word that he uses is Haltung, which is not a cognitive orientation, but as you hear it, the way you hold yourself, posture yourself vis-a-vis the other, vis-a-vis the world. And I think that's what Buber has found. Well, you're all invited for beer, I guess.
We have a reception downstairs in the first floor common room to which everyone is cordially invited. And again, let us salute and thank Professor